In the summer of 1954, a Presbyterian minister named George McPherson Dougherty stepped into the pulpit of New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., and delivered a sermon that would forever alter the spiritual landscape of America. Sitting in the congregation that morning was President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had come to hear what he thought would be a routine Sunday service. Instead, Dougherty challenged the president and the nation with words that cut to the heart of American identity. Apart from the mention of the phrase, the United States of America, the minister declared, it could be the pledge of any republic. In fact, I could hear little Muscovites repeat a similar pledge to their hammer and sickle flag in Moscow. Within months, Congress had added two words that would transform the Pledge of Allegiance forever: under God. But this moment wasn't the beginning of America's relationship with divine authority. It was perhaps the beginning of its end. For behind this seemingly triumphant assertion of faith lay a profound transformation that had been centuries in the making, one that would see the cross of Christianity gradually give way to the flag of nationalism as America's primary object of devotion. The story begins not in 1954, but in 1630, aboard a ship called the Arbella, somewhere in the cold Atlantic waters between England and the New World. John Winthrop, the future governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, stood before his fellow Puritan passengers and delivered one of the most influential sermons in American history. "We shall be as a city upon a hill," he proclaimed, his voice carrying over the creaking timber and crashing waves. "The eyes of all people are upon us." But here's what most people don't realize about Winthrop's famous metaphor. He wasn't speaking about American exceptionalism or national greatness. He was delivering a warning wrapped in biblical imagery, telling his fellow colonists that they had entered into a covenant with God, and that their success or failure would depend entirely on their faithfulness to divine law. For the Puritans, there was no distinction between church and state, because there was no distinction between sacred and secular life. Every law, every decision, every aspect of governance flowed from their understanding of biblical mandate. The cross didn't just symbolize their faith, it was the foundation upon which their entire society was built. When they established Harvard College in 1636, its motto wasn't Veritas as it is today, but Veritas Christo et Ecclesiae, truth for Christ and the Church. When they created their legal codes, they drew directly from Old Testament law. When they went to war, they saw themselves as God's chosen people, fighting against the forces of darkness. But even in those early decades, cracks were beginning to show in this theocratic foundation. In 1635, a young minister named Roger Williams found himself banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony for the radical proposition that civil government had no authority over matters of conscience. Williams fled into the wilderness and founded what would become Rhode Island, establishing the first government in human history to guarantee complete religious freedom. It was a revolutionary idea that would echo through the centuries, but at the time, most of his fellow colonists viewed Williams as a dangerous heretic who threatened the very foundations of their godly society. The first major shift in American religious identity came not through philosophical argument, but through simple necessity. As more colonies were established and more diverse groups of Christians arrived, Anglicans in Virginia, Catholics in Maryland, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Dutch Reformed in New York, it became increasingly impossible to maintain the Puritan ideal of religious uniformity. By the time of the Revolutionary War, America was home to dozens of different Christian denominations, each convinced they possessed the true interpretation of divine will. It was into this religious complexity that the Founding Fathers stepped, carrying with them an intellectual inheritance from the Enlightenment that would prove far more revolutionary than most Americans realize. When Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he made a crucial theological decision that often goes unnoticed. Rather than invoking Jesus Christ or biblical authority, Jefferson appealed to nature's God and divine providence, deliberately vague terms that could encompass the God of Christianity while not excluding other possibilities. This wasn't accidental. Jefferson, along with many of his fellow founders, had been deeply influenced by deism, a philosophical movement that viewed God as a distant creator who had set the universe in motion but no longer intervened in human affairs. The Constitution, when it was finally written in 1787, contained an even more radical departure from America's theocratic origins. Article 6 explicitly prohibited religious tests for federal office, and the First Amendment, ratified in 1791, declared that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. For the first time in American history, the federal government was officially neutral on matters of faith. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Even as the Founding Fathers were creating a secular framework for government, they were simultaneously laying the groundwork for a new kind of sacred nationalism. Consider the Great Seal of the United States, designed in 1782. On one side sits an eagle, wings spread, clutching arrows and an olive branch. Above the eagle hovers the Eye of Providence, surrounded by the words Annuit Coeptis. He favors our undertakings. This wasn't Christian symbolism exactly, but it was certainly religious symbolism, suggesting that America itself enjoyed special divine favor. The real transformation began during the War of 1812, when Americans faced the very real possibility that their young nation might not survive. It was during the bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor that Francis Scott Key penned the words that would become the Star-Spangled Banner. But listen carefully to the often overlooked final verse. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. Notice how Key links American military victory directly to divine blessing, suggesting that God himself is on America's side in battle. This conflation of national identity with divine purpose accelerated dramatically during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, perhaps more than any other president, understood the dangerous power of religious nationalism. In his second inaugural address, delivered just weeks before his assassination, Lincoln offered a profound meditation on the problem of both sides in a conflict claiming divine sanction. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other, Lincoln observed. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. But even as Lincoln warned against the presumption of claiming God's exclusive favor, the war itself was creating new forms of sacred nationalism. The battlefield at Gettysburg became hallowed ground, Lincoln's words there transforming a military cemetery into something approaching a religious shrine. The American flag, which had been a relatively minor symbol before the war, emerged as an object of intense devotion. For the first time, ordinary Americans began displaying flags in their homes, treating the stars and stripes with a reverence previously reserved for religious icons. The late 19th century witnessed an explosion of what historians now call civil religion, the transformation of American national symbols into objects of quasi-religious devotion. The Pledge of Allegiance, written in 1892 by Christian socialist Francis Bellamy, was originally intended as a patriotic exercise for school children. But notice something crucial about Bellamy's original version. It contained no reference to God whatsoever. Children across America recited, "I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible with liberty and justice for all." The absence of religious language wasn't accidental. Bellamy, despite being a minister, deliberately crafted a pledge that could unite Americans of all faiths around shared civic values rather than specific theological beliefs. In doing so, he was participating in a broader cultural transformation that was gradually shifting the focus of American devotion from the cross to the flag. This transformation accelerated during the early 20th century as America grappled with massive immigration and social upheaval. Millions of Catholics, Jews, and Orthodox Christians poured into American cities, challenging the Protestant dominance that had characterized American religion since colonial times. In response, Protestant leaders began emphasizing American identity as a way of maintaining cultural authority even as their religious authority waned. The two world wars completed this transformation in ways that would have shocked the Puritan founders. During World War I, President Woodrow Wilson cast American involvement in explicitly religious terms, declaring that America would fight to make the world safe for democracy. This wasn't just political rhetoric. Wilson, the son of a Presbyterian minister, genuinely believed that America had been chosen by God to spread democratic values around the globe. Churches across the country echoed this message, with ministers declaring that fighting for America was the same as fighting for God. World War II took this sacred nationalism to even greater heights. The fight against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan was portrayed not just as a military conflict, but as a cosmic battle between good and evil, with America serving as God's instrument for defeating the forces of darkness. This religious interpretation of the war was reinforced by the Holocaust, which seemed to confirm that America was indeed fighting against ultimate evil. It was in this context that we return to that Presbyterian church in 1954, where Reverend Doherty challenged President Eisenhower to add "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. But here's the irony that Doherty himself may not have fully grasped. By insisting that America acknowledge God in its civic rituals, he was actually completing the transformation from Christian to national religion. The God invoked in the new pledge wasn't the God of any particular Christian denomination, but rather a generic deity whose primary function was to bless America. This shift becomes even clearer when we examine what was happening to traditional Christianity during the same period. Church attendance was indeed high in the 1950s, but studies reveal that most Americans knew remarkably little about basic Christian doctrine. When pollsters asked Americans about their religious beliefs, they typically responded with vague affirmations of faith that had been emptied of specific theological content. Sociologist Will Herberg captured this phenomenon in his 1955 book, Protestant Catholic Jew, noting that Americans were becoming increasingly religious but decreasingly Christian. The 1960s brought this transformation into sharp focus as America faced a series of moral and political crises that traditional Christianity seemed unable to address. The civil rights movement exposed the uncomfortable reality that many of America's most devout Christians were also its most committed defenders of racial segregation. The Vietnam War divided American churches just as it divided American society, with Christians on both sides claiming divine sanction for their positions. It was during this turbulent decade that a new form of American civil religion emerged, one that explicitly challenged traditional Christian authority while maintaining the forms of religious devotion. When Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, he was performing a profoundly religious act, but the God he invoked was not the God of traditional Christianity. Instead, King appealed to what he called the American dream, a secular vision of justice and equality that transcended denominational boundaries. The memorial itself had become a kind of national cathedral, with Lincoln's statue serving as a secular saint watching over the American faithful. Visitors approached the memorial with the same reverence they might show in a church, speaking in hushed tones and removing their hats in respect. The words of the Gettysburg Address and Second Inaugural Address, carved into the memorial's walls, had become something approaching sacred scripture for the American civil religion. By the 1970s, this transformation was largely complete. Public schools across America began each day not with prayer, which the Supreme Court had prohibited in 1962, but with the Pledge of Allegiance, a ritual that maintained the forms of religious devotion while redirecting that devotion toward national rather than specifically Christian symbols. Students stood, placed their hands over their hearts, and recited words of allegiance to the flag with the same solemnity their great-grandparents had once reserved for reciting the Lord's Prayer. The flag itself had become the primary sacred symbol of American life. Flag Day, established as a national observance in 1916, grew into an occasion for quasi-religious celebration. The Flag Code, enacted by Congress in 1942, established elaborate rituals for the proper handling, display, and disposal of flags that bore striking resemblance to the ceremonial laws surrounding religious relics. Americans who would never think of bowing before a crucifix would stand at attention as the flag passed by in a parade, their behavior indistinguishable from religious worship. This civil religion reached its apotheosis during the Reagan presidency of the 1980s. Reagan, himself a former Hollywood actor, understood better than most politicians the power of symbolic performance. His speeches were filled with religious language, but the God he invoked was invariably the God of America, a deity whose primary attribute was blessing the United States above all other nations. When Reagan declared that America was a shining city upon a hill, he was deliberately echoing John Winthrop's famous sermon, but stripping it of Winthrop's warning about divine judgment and retaining only the promise of divine favor. The end of the Cold War in 1991 presented American civil religion with its greatest challenge since the founding of the Republic. For nearly half a century, American national identity had been defined largely in opposition to godless communism. With the Soviet Union's collapse, America needed a new narrative to justify its role as the world's dominant power. The response was to universalize American civil religion, suggesting that America's values, democracy, free markets, individual rights, were not merely American values but universal human values that America had a divine mandate to spread around the world. The September 11, 2001 attacks provided a dramatic reaffirmation of American civil religion's power. In the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attacks, Americans flocked to churches, but they also engaged in unprecedented displays of flag worship. Flags appeared on cars, houses, clothing, and bodies with an intensity that bordered on the frantic. The phrase, "God bless America," became a kind of national prayer, but the God being invoked was clearly the God of American civil religion rather than the God of traditional Christianity. President George W. Bush, himself a born-again Christian, exemplified this fusion of Christian and civil religion in his response to 9/11. His speeches were filled with biblical language and imagery, but the ultimate message was always the same. God had chosen America to lead the fight against evil in the world. When Bush declared that nations were either with us or against us in the war on terror, he was making a theological claim about America's role in God's plan for history. Today, as we stand more than 2 decades into the 21st century, the transformation that began in 1630 appears largely complete. American civil religion has not merely supplemented traditional Christianity. In many ways, it has replaced it as the primary focus of American devotion. Consider the rituals that define American public life. The daily pledge to the flag in schools, the singing of the national anthem before sporting events, the elaborate ceremonies surrounding Veterans Day and Memorial Day, the pilgrimage sites at Mount Rushmore and the National Mall. These are the practices that unite Americans across denominational lines, the shared acts of worship that define membership in the American community. This shift has had profound implications for traditional Christianity in America. Churches that once served as the primary arbiters of moral authority now find themselves competing with cable news networks and social media platforms for influence over their congregation's beliefs. Christian leaders who once spoke with unquestioned authority on matters of public morality now find their pronouncements subject to political litmus tests. The cross, which once served as the primary symbol of American identity, has been relegated to private spaces while the flag claims the public square. But perhaps the most telling evidence of this transformation can be found in the response to perceived disrespect toward American national symbols. When Colin Kaepernick knelt during the national anthem in 2016 to protest police brutality, the reaction was swift and intense. Millions of Americans who would never consider themselves particularly religious responded with the fury of believers witnessing blasphemy. The flag and the anthem had become sacred in a way that transcended mere patriotism, touching something deeper in the American psyche. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the hidden stories that shaped our world. If you're enjoying this exploration of how America's spiritual landscape transformed over centuries, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Drop a comment and let me know what profession you have. Are you a teacher, a student, a fellow history enthusiast? It's fascinating to see how these stories resonate with people from all walks of life. And if this content brings value to your day, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. It really helps us continue bringing you these in-depth historical investigations. The irony, of course, is that this transformation has occurred precisely as America has become more religiously diverse than ever before. Today's America is home to millions of Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and adherents of dozens of other faith traditions, along with a rapidly growing population of religious knowns who claim no particular faith at all. In this context, American civil religion serves a function that traditional Christianity no longer can, providing a shared sacred canopy under which all Americans, regardless of their private religious beliefs, can gather as a unified community. Yet this unity comes at a cost. The God of American civil religion is a peculiar deity, one whose primary attributes seem to be blessing America's military adventures and sanctifying its economic system. This God demands loyalty to country above all other loyalties, including traditional religious commitments. When American civil religion conflicts with traditional Christianity, as it did during the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and countless other moral crises, it is often civil religion that wins. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a stark illustration of this transformation's completion. When governors across the country issued stay-at-home orders in March 2020, many explicitly exempted essential businesses while requiring churches to close. The message was clear. In modern America, the mall is more sacred than the sanctuary, commerce more essential than communion. Churches that had once served as the moral center of American communities found themselves relegated to the same category as entertainment venues, dispensable luxuries rather than essential services. Even more telling was the response of many American Christians to these restrictions. Rather than accepting temporary closure as a reasonable public health measure, many churches insisted that their religious freedom was under attack. But the religious freedom they defended was not the freedom to worship God, which could easily be exercised online or in small groups. Instead, they demanded the freedom to gather in large groups for public worship, suggesting that the communal and performative aspects of religion had become more important than the spiritual ones. This brings us to perhaps the most profound question raised by America's transformation from cross to flag. What happens to a society when its primary object of devotion becomes itself? Traditional religions, for all their flaws and failures, at least point toward something beyond the immediate community, toward transcendent values that can serve as a check on human pride and ambition. American civil religion, by contrast, tends to sanctify American power and prosperity, making it difficult for Americans to engage in the kind of moral self-criticism that healthy societies require. The consequences of this transformation are visible throughout American culture today. Political debates that might once have been settled through appeal to shared moral principles now become battles between competing visions of American identity. Each side claims exclusive access to the true meaning of American symbols, whether the flag, the Constitution, or the Founding Fathers. The result is a society that maintains the passionate intensity of religious conviction while lacking the transcendent perspective that might moderate that intensity. Consider how Americans discuss their country's role in the world. Where previous generations might have debated whether particular military interventions were morally justified according to Christian principles of just war theory, contemporary Americans are more likely to debate whether those interventions serve American interests or reflect American values. The moral framework has shifted from universal principles that might condemn American actions to particularistic values that almost always justify them. This transformation also helps explain the rise of political movements that treat opposition to their vision of America as literally sacrilegious. When the flag becomes sacred, burning it becomes blasphemy. When the Constitution becomes scripture, interpreting it differently becomes heresy. When America itself becomes God's chosen nation, criticizing America becomes criticism of God. The 2020 election and its aftermath provided perhaps the clearest illustration of American civil religion's power and danger. The January 6, 2021 assault on the Capitol was carried out by people who genuinely believed they were defending sacred American institutions against desecration. They carried flags and crosses, but it was clear which symbol held primary authority. The flags they planted in the Capitol were not merely political statements, but religious claims, assertions that they alone understood America's true sacred identity. Yet, even as American civil religion reaches new heights of intensity, signs of its potential decline are becoming visible. Younger Americans, particularly those under 30, show markedly less reverence for traditional American symbols and narratives. They are more likely to view American history critically, to question claims of American exceptionalism, and to resist the kind of patriotic rituals that their parents and grandparents took for granted. For many young Americans, the flag represents not divine blessing but historical oppression, not moral authority but moral failure. This generational divide suggests that America may be approaching another major transformation in its spiritual landscape. Just as the Civil War marked the beginning of America's transition from Protestant to civil religion, the current cultural upheaval may be marking the beginning of a transition away from civil religion towards something not yet clearly defined. Some scholars suggest that America is experiencing a process of desacralization, a gradual removal of sacred significance from public life that parallels the secularization experienced by European societies in the 20th century. If this interpretation is correct, then the future may see not the replacement of the flag with some new sacred symbol, but rather the abandonment of the quest for sacred symbols, altogether in favor of a purely secular public square. Others argue that Americans' need for sacred meaning is too deep to be satisfied by purely secular alternatives, and that new forms of religious expression are already emerging to fill the void left by declining traditional Christianity and potentially declining civil religion. Environmental activism, social justice movements, and various forms of spiritual but not religious identity all show characteristics of emerging religious movements, complete with their own sacred texts, ritual practices, and moral authorities. What seems certain is that the era of unchallenged Christian hegemony in American culture is over, and the era of unchallenged civil religious hegemony may be ending as well. The flag may have replaced the cross as America's primary sacred symbol, but the flag's own sacred status is increasingly under challenge. What will replace it remains to be seen. The story of how the flag replaced the cross in America is ultimately a story about the human need for sacred meaning and the ways that need adapts to changing historical circumstances. The Puritans who landed at Plymouth Rock would hardly recognize the America that exists today, but they would certainly recognize the intensity with which Americans pursue their vision of divine purpose. The objects of devotion have changed, but the devotion itself remains as powerful as ever. Perhaps this is the most important lesson of America's spiritual transformation. Sacred symbols derive their power not from their inherent characteristics, but from the meaning invested in them by believing communities. The cross was powerful because Christians believed it connected them to ultimate reality. The flag is powerful because Americans believe it connects them to ultimate reality. And whatever symbol emerges next will be powerful only insofar as Americans invest it with the capacity to bear the weight of their deepest longings for meaning, purpose, and transcendence. The question facing contemporary America is not whether it will continue to have sacred symbols. The human need for the sacred appears to be too fundamental to eliminate, but what those symbols will be and what kind of community they will create. Will they be symbols that unite Americans across their differences, or will they be symbols that divide Americans into competing sacred communities? Will they be symbols that point toward transcendent values capable of judging American behavior, or will they be symbols that sanctify American power regardless of how that power is used?